Okay, so I would say basically for all of these types of memory, there are certain processes that have to happen in order for the memory to be successfully encoded and retrieved. And so these are the processes that happen, basically with any type of memory. So with any memory, the first step is going to be encoding that memory. I have images here that kind of relate this to like computer metaphors a little bit. So if you think about like in a computer, like the keyboard, the microphone right now, those are all tools that are used to encode a memory into my computer. So I can open up Word and I can type up a document and I'm creating this new thing that then is going to be saved to my computer, right? So encoding is that first step of just kind of like taking in the information. I should also mention too that like any of these steps could be disrupted, and if one of the steps is disrupted, then you're not going to get successful retrieval of that memory later on. So during encoding, one of the main things that can disrupt it is basically attention. So if right now, instead of paying attention to what I'm saying, if you're like, on Facebook or something, and your attention is not on me, then you're not going to encode what I'm saying, so you're not going to be able to remember it later. So attention is often one of the things that can kind of disrupt at that first step. Once a memory is encoded, then it has to be stored. So storage is where you're kind of, permanently putting this memory somewhere where it's going to live so that you can retrieve it later. So again, if we, think of the computer metaphor, that's basically like me saving my Word document to a folder on my desktop or whatever so I can go retrieve it later. So sometimes you might encode a memory, you might be paying attention, it might kind of get through your perceptual system, but you do not store it. Usually for storage to happen, you need to make some kind of connection between, the stuff that you already know and this new information. So, we'll talk about study tips in a second, but that's kind of like alluding to one already. So if you really want to learn something and remember it later, the best thing to do is to try to, like I said, form connections with other things that have happened in your past. That'll kind of help with that storage process. Let's see, I'll also kind of diverge here and talk about, so if we're talking about storage, then, these memories are stored kind of in specific areas of the brain. I have a slide here that's not in the PowerPoint because I just added it. I kind of forgot that I hadn't put it in there, but this is in your textbook. So if you open the textbook from the website, you'll be able to see it there. And these are some of the areas that are involved in these memory processes. So I talked about the cerebellum earlier. That's really important for those procedural memories. I also talked a little bit about the hippocampus. The hippocampus is really the main area that sort of encodes memories, that takes them in, and then helps with the storage process later. The amygdala is also listed here. The amygdala is really important for emotional processing. And depending on kind of our emotional state, that can actually alter the way that we store memories. So typically, like if something traumatic or stressful happens, then the amygdala causes this kind of physical response where there is a flood of different hormones and neurotransmitters, and those all basically affect the way that we store memories. So typically if something stressful or traumatic is happening, we tend to store those memories in a more permanent way, I would say. So if you think of someone who has like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, PTSD is usually caused because someone had something traumatic happen. While that traumatic thing was happening, their amygdala would have been very active. That would have caused the memory of whatever's happening in that moment to be stored in a way that it's like almost impossible to forget, essentially, to where they have like intrusive, recurring thoughts about that event. And then the prefrontal cortex is also highly involved. Prefrontal cortex does a lot with working memory that I was talking about earlier, so sort of directing attention. So it would be really involved in that encoding step as well, like trying to decide, this is what I'm going to pay attention to. I need to ignore all these distractions. So those are some of the areas that are important for these memory processes. I always forget if I go forward when I'm recording, then my PowerPoint will not allow me to go back because it'll stop recording. So I'm just going to write those steps real quick up here. So we have encoding and then storage. And then the next step would have been consolidation. and then retrieval. Okay, another thing I'll say about storage, though, before I move on to consolidation is, so these are some of the areas that are important for this process, but memories aren't necessarily like stored in one part of the brain. It's not like you have like a little memory, like RAM stick in your brain somewhere that holds all your memories. Instead, most memories are kind of distributed throughout the cortex. So, we talked about the cortex. That's the thing that has those 4 different lobes. It has the occipital lobe that processes visual information, parietal processes like motor information, temporal processes auditory information, and then the prefrontal cortex I've already talked about, kind of directing attention. So like, let's say, for example, you're remembering, your 10th birthday, you got to go ride on a fire truck or something. And you're actively trying to remember that event. Then basically what's happening in your brain is just reactivating all of those perceptual areas that would have been active when that was happening. So while you were riding the fire truck, there's a part of your visual cortex that's seeing like, okay, here's the color red, and I see like the shape of the fire truck. Your auditory cortex is hearing the sound of the siren and like, coding that. So then when you remember it, you're basically just reactivating those same areas of the cortex. So memory is almost, it's very similar to actual perception. It's just you're remembering it from the past instead of it happening in the present. Yeah, Alex.
Okay, so you're saying that the part of the brain in which we remember visual information is the same part that we are actively using to see.
Yes.
Present.
Yes.
So if we are then trying to visually imagine something that we have maybe from a book or something like that we have never seen, and we're still using the same part of our brain.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So imagination also basically works almost the same way. There's kind of this interesting thing. I maybe should have put it like when I'm doing any of these, I have to like pick like what do I want to talk about. One of the really interesting things about memory is that the parts of the brain that are active when you're remembering the past are identical to the ones when you're imagining the future or imagining anything really. So yeah, there's a lot of like basically real-time perception, past memories, and future imagination are all using the same parts of the brain. I would say the main difference between a memory and real perception is that right now, like my visual cortex is active, but there's also all this activity in my retina and the pathways we talked about that go from the retina to the primary visual cortex. Those are all active because there's actual light coming in, right? Whenever I'm remembering something, it's only the cortex that's going to be active. You're not getting that activity from the retina and from the areas that connect from the retina to the visual cortex.
That makes sense because it's easier to imagine something visually or recall memory with your eyes closed.
Yes,
If
yeah.
Being bombarded, that part of your brain is being bombarded with new information.
Yes, exactly.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay. Where was I? I got off track a little bit, which is always perfectly fine. Okay, so we talked quite a bit about encoding and storage. So again, main thing, storage of memories is kind of all over the cortex, basically. Consolidation is a really interesting process, and it's one that your textbook, I don't think, talks about at all. Consolidation is basically this process of strengthening a memory once it's stored. So you can encode it and then store it, and then consolidation is kind of strengthening. There's actually lots of different types of consolidation as well, so it's a little bit tricky to talk about. I will say that sleep is extremely important for this step, for consolidating a memory. So there's things that are physically happening in your brain while you're sleeping, where it's almost like your brain is kind of rewiring itself a little bit while you're sleeping to try to strengthen those connections you made throughout the day. So like right now, you're taking this class and I asked you to remember something fun you did over the summer. So theoretically, you made this little connection between like, here's the stuff I learned today in class, and here's this fun time I had over the summer. So in the future, whenever you remember that fun day in the summer, you might also then remember like, oh, I remember talking about this in psych class, and I remember that day we were talking about memory, right? So you've made this connection between these two different parts of your brain, and there is an actual physical connection that's happening. And whenever you go to sleep tonight, if your brain decides that that information is important, then it's basically going to strengthen those connections. It's going to send actual like proteins and resources and stuff to build up that physical connection. And sometimes that happens at the expense of other connections. So there might be other stuff that you learned that like your brain decides that's not very important. I'm going to kind of break down these connections so I can use these pieces to build up other connections. Does that make sense? Yeah, Kel.
Is that why when you dream, there's like some correlation between what you're doing?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so there's one theory of dreaming that basically says that what's happening when you're dreaming is that consolidation process is, because if you think about it, right, I could easily imagine that tonight I go to sleep and I have a dream where like it starts out and I'm in class, but then all of a sudden I'm like back at this place that I was at over the summer, like maybe the class and the beach fuse into one thing, and like, you know what I mean? Like dreams have that weird ethereal nature where there's like things from different events in your life that connect in weird ways. And it might be because your brain is doing this process of like, oh, I'm going to connect this thing from the past with this thing that happened today. And then I'm going to make a little story that makes it make sense. So yeah, that's probably what dreams are, maybe. It's one theory. This is a great question. Any other questions about this? The other thing I will say, so there's kind of that cellular level consolidation is what I'm talking about, where you're building connections between neurons. But there's also kind of this reorganization that's happening in the cortex as well. So initially, whenever you form a memory, it's very dependent on the hippocampus. So the hippocampus kind of takes in that information. It decides like, okay, this is important. I'm going to try to store this. And it starts kind of like organizing that stuff out to the cortex and helping make those connections. And like on day one, if you're going to remember that thing, you're going to get lots of activity in the hippocampus and in the cortex. Through this consolidation process, it basically makes it so that memory is less dependent on the hippocampus. So over time, every night that you sleep, if your brain keeps deciding this is important, I'm going to keep this, then it's going to strengthen all the connections I talked about earlier in the cortex, and then the hippocampus isn't really necessary anymore to remember that. So that's why if someone gets damage to the hippocampus, the memories from their past are all consolidated in the cortex. So they're like safe and protected. You can still remember that. But going forward, you won't be able to make any new memories because the hippocampus is damaged and it's not able to like make, you know, those connections. Does that all make sense? Okay. All right. So we've got encoding, storage, consolidation. So all three of those can happen successfully, and you still might not necessarily be able to retrieve that piece of information. How many of you ever had the experience of like something's on the tip of your tongue, but you can't remember it, right? So like you know that that word or whatever is there, like you're 100% confident that you learned this information. And sometimes when you have that, if you just get like the right cue, like if somebody tells you, oh, it starts with this letter, or it has this many syllables, then like that's just enough information to push you over the edge to like, okay, now I remember, right? You all had that experience before? So that kind of demonstrates this, right? That even if you have all three of these happen, you encoded the memory, you stored it, you consolidated it, but in that moment, retrieval is failing. Usually retrieval fails because you don't have the right cues. So cues are very important. And by cues, I just mean the things that like, you know, prompt someone to try to remember something. Retrieval is also more likely to be successful if you're retrieving in an environment that matches encoding. So if you're trying to remember something, it's often helpful to like go back to the place that you learned that in the first place, if possible. Or to try to be like in the same state of mind even. So by environment, I mean very broad. So, you know, there's kind of this issue that I would run into when I was a student at Iowa State University. You know, Iowa State is like this huge state school where there's like 30,000 students, right? And when I took an intro psych class, there were like 300 students in a class. And there were, you know, 4 sections or whatever of that. So there's like thousands of students taking intro psych at any given time. So whenever we took tests, what they would do is like I would have my intro psych class at, you know, 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, but they would be like, okay, we're going to take the test at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday, like 7 in the evening, and you're going to do it in a totally different classroom, and we're going to mix you up with all these students from other classes that you've never seen before. So like the environment that we learned in was completely different from the environment we're taking a test in. And there's studies that show that doing that actually decreases test scores because it's helpful, right? Like right now, you're not just remembering what I'm saying, you're remembering all this context. You're remembering like, okay, I'm sitting at this table, there's this person beside me, the projector's up there and it has this picture on it. And all of those are little cues or little associations your brain makes. So when you come to take the test and there's a question, you might even sort of unconsciously do it without realizing. You might kind of like look around the classroom if you're trying to remember the answer to a question. You might look up at the projector and try to like imagine like, okay, I remember she talked about this and there was a picture of the brain. You know what I mean? So like you're activating all of those cues from the environment that help you then remember the information. So having the right cues, being in the same environment. Do I have anything else in my notes? I think those are the main things. So if you have disruptions in either of those, then you can still fail to retrieve something, even if all the other three are successful. All right, the last thing I'll say about all of this too, just to kind of reiterate something I said earlier, is that even when we're retrieving something successfully, it feels like we're retrieving a coherent whole memory, right? If I ask you what you did over the summer or whatever, it feels like you can kind of like play this movie back in your head. But in reality, probably only very few like little bits and pieces of that day actually made it through all these steps, right? There might be a few like highlights that you encoded, you stored, you consolidated, now you're retrieving them, and there's all these gaps in your memory. But what your brain does is like, well, I'm just going to fill in those gaps with things that make sense. And what makes sense is often based off of our past experiences, or it's based off of things that we've seen from other people, or we've seen in movies, or we've seen in the news, or whatever. So we kind of piece together all this other information to fill in those gaps. So most of your memories are probably not 100% accurate. Okay? Yeah.
I was going to say that I remember watching some videos actually about memory and like childhood memories. And they'd taken a dude in a bar and just walked up to him and showed him a video saying that it was him in elementary school at graduation and all this stuff and this stuff happened and whatnot.
Yeah.
Like he turned around and he actually believed that it was his own memory, when in actuality it was completely different than the videotaped version.
Yeah. So one of the failures we often think of with memory is like forgetting, like, oh, I forgot this thing. But one of the most common failures is actually what's called a false memory, where you think something happened, or you think something happened a specific way, or you think there's some specific detail that's true, but in reality, your brain basically just made it up. And yeah, that can come from some of these issues we've talked about. It can also come from an issue it's called source monitoring. So whenever I'm remembering a piece of information, I don't just need to remember that piece of information, I need to also remember where it came from. Like, is it something that happened to me? Is it a story that a friend told me and I just kind of imagined in my head? Is it a movie I saw? Is it a dream I had? Have any of you ever had the experience of like you dream something and then you think it was real like later and maybe you act on that? Yeah, I've had the same thing. Like I remember having just like some random weird conversation with my husband, and he's like, what are you talking about? Like we've never talked about that ever or whatever. And at some point I realized like, oh my gosh, I dreamed that. It didn't actually happen in real life, right? So it's not just remembering the information, it's remembering where it came from. And that can often lead to these false memories or, kind of like partially false, inaccurate memories. Any other questions or comments about any of that? Let me look at my notes, make sure I didn't skip anything major, because we went in all kinds of directions today. I don't think so. Okay, last thing before you guys leave. I see some of you packing up, but this is maybe the most important thing you could get from this entire class. So I would say pay attention to this. So these are some study tips that I put together, and almost all of these are based in some way on actual research. Some of them are also just based on things that like I have found to be successful. So in some of these we've also already talked about. So study tip number 1 is to try to find connections between new material and things you already know. I think that one we've talked about quite a bit. The more of those connections you make, the more likely it is that you're going to remember the information that you're studying. The second one I want to really, really emphasize, this kind of goes back to that overconfidence issue we talked about earlier. So a lot of people, kind of the natural thing that we want to do is to do what's easy, because often what is easy feels nice. Like if we're doing what's easy, we feel confident in ourselves, we feel successful. It just feels good often to do things that are easy. And I think students often take that approach with studying. Like you might open up your textbook or look through your notes or listen to the videos, and all the stuff that's easy, you're like, okay, I get this, so I want to maybe listen to it again or read it again because it's easy to absorb. And then you get to the difficult parts, the parts that don't make sense, the parts that make your brain hurt and that make you frustrated. And it's kind of human nature to just want to like skip over those or rush past them, right? But in reality, those are the things you need to focus on the most, because the easy material you already know, that's why it's easy. So you're kind of wasting your time restudying that. But the difficult stuff, that's the stuff, it's difficult because you don't know it, right? You get what I'm saying? So if you find that something in any class, not just this one, in any class, if you find that there's material that's particularly difficult, then like drill down into that material and try to use some of these tips to make that material easier. Try to find connections in your personal life to that material. Another really important thing to do is to think like an instructor. So again, not just in this class, but in all your classes. If you're studying for a test, one of the things you have to do is try to figure out, like, what do you think is going to be on that test? And one of the best ways to approach that is to try to put yourself in the position of your instructor. Try to think like, okay, if I was teaching this class, what are the things that I would think is important, the things that I would want to ask test questions on? And then maybe like make yourself a little practice quiz based on that, and then, kind of quiz yourself from there. This kind of ties into that, so prioritize what seems important. Again, that comes from trying to think like your instructor and thinking what they think is important. Quizzing yourself, we've already talked about quite a bit. The one thing I will say about quizzing yourself, it's been shown, again, through studies, that doing that actually helps with this consolidation process as well. So whenever you take a quiz over a material, you're actually helping to strengthen that memory of the material, more so than if you just like reread it over again. So giving yourself practice quizzes is really important. Sharing what you learned with other people. So, if you maybe call your mom after class and tell her like, hey mom, I learned about this thing today, and try to tell her in as much detail, whatever you can remember, or talk to your roommate or your friend or, whatever, any person you can find, try to tell them the things that you've learned, because again, that'll help strengthen those memories. Another really important one is to distribute your studying. So a lot of people tend to cram right before the exam. You have an exam coming up, you've procrastinated, you haven't studied very much, so the day before the test, you're just gonna study like crazy. That's not very effective. It's much more effective to have short study sessions that you spread out over time. So I would recommend every day, just set aside 30 minutes. And every day spend 30 minutes studying this class or whatever other classes you have that you think are important, instead of waiting until the day before and studying a ton. And then this last one, try to study a couple hours before you go to sleep. So again, this consolidation process really benefits from sleep, and you get the most benefits if your study is relatively close to when you fall asleep, because then it's fresh in your mind, and your brain basically decides okay, I just learned this is important, so I'm going to consolidate it. So whenever you're planning your day, if possible, try to plan your study sessions just a couple hours before you're going to go to bed. Okay, that's a lot. If you want any more detail about any of these or why I think they're effective or whatever, feel free to come talk to me during my office hours, send me an email, and we can talk about it more. That's all for today. So everybody, have a good rest of your day. I will see you on Thursday.